For more insight on the story, we're now joined by Chad Thomas, Organised crime investigator from IRS Forensic Investigations, and he joins us now via our video link. Chad, thank you so much for joining us this evening here in SABC News. Perhaps let's start off here. What do you make of the latest revelations coming out from that leaked affidavit from the former chairperson of VBS Bank, and how we now know what really went on in the collapsing of the bank?
Good evening, Barley. Good evening to the viewers. Look, I think it's very important what's come out here. One must understand that this is now the second conviction through a guilty plea in the VBS saga. The first, of course, was 4 years ago when Philip Truter pleaded guilty and received a 10-year sentence. We now have Matoti, who's pleaded guilty, but we've now also had sight of his affidavit that was made as part of this plea agreement. And when one reads it, it reads like a sophisticated crime novel. It goes into the very belly of the beast in respect of how this bank was set up and then stripped completely, and how they desperately needed more monies to come in, whether it was from municipalities, whether it was from the PRC, or whether they even went to the length of creating fictitious credits in accounts that they could then draw on. I think that this development shows the tenacity of the NPA and the Hawks, because for far too long we've been calling for justice, but one doesn't take into consideration the amount of work that goes into these cases. And when one reads that statement and you see the amount of transactions that took place, which are in the hundreds, involving dozens of different special purpose vehicles and dozens of different bank accounts and individuals, one can just understand the task that the investigators had to get to this point in the investigation.
And perhaps maybe give us that bit of insight when it comes to investigating a matter like this. What actually goes to an investigation of this magnitude, where we are trying to recoup almost 2 billion rand?
Look, it's a massive crime, and we're looking at all kinds of interrelated crimes in this respect. We're looking at fraud, we're looking at theft, we're looking at money laundering, we're looking at the proceeds of crime, we're looking at racketeering, because a lot of people were involved in the way in which this operated. And of course, people benefited and they lived large. You look at the homes that they owned in closed-off estates. You look at the vehicles. Matoti, for example, had a Ferrari, he had a Porsche, he had a Land Rover, and all the people around him that had to be looked after through gratification were also living large. What's very interesting in his affidavit is how more and more people had to be, in inverted commas, looked after. In other words, gratifications had to be paid to all these individuals to try to keep this under wraps. And I'm sure he knew, as along with the others, that sooner or later it would come to an end. Sooner or later that bubble would burst. There would be no more money coming in from municipalities. The PRC would have a thorough forensic audit. And of course, the South African Reserve Bank was looking for answers. Now, when you investigate a matter like this, you obviously want what's called restorative justice, you want financial restitution, you want the money to be placed back in the hands from where it was taken. So following the money is so critical in this particular case. But Matoti himself is an exceptionally clever individual, and the judge even referred to the fact that he gets held to a higher standard because he's a chartered accountant. He came in as a chartered accountant, a very skilled individual, and he set up this mammoth money laundering machine that benefited him, those around him, and those that then needed gratification. And the investigation would have taken thousands of hours, just looking at the amount of documents they would have had to have gone through in terms of the company registrations, the individuals that were involved, and the bank accounts. And then, of course, when you get a bank account, you see it gets funds are transferred from one account to the next. You have to then obtain those contra accounts and go through those accounts. So again, hats off to the DPCI. The Hawks have really done a sterling job here. Hats off to the NPA for securing so far 2 plea agreements in this case that has really left the poorest of the poor in a very sorry state.
What does it say about the political elite and the politically connected when it comes to the looting of this bank?
Look, it's absolutely despicable. He speaks to the fact, and we're talking about Botodzi now, of course, in his affidavit that he made that was leaked to the public at the end of last week. He speaks to the fact that he grew up in Venda, that he had a bank account there. His mother had a bank account. She had a bakery. That bakery banked with that organization. So he knew how important that bank was to the people that it served. He knew that people's dreams were built on the bank, how people saved so that they could send their children like him to university so that they could be educated and lead a better life. The fact that the poorest of the poor have been so neglected in this matter, because what I haven't seen come out of the cases where Truta pleaded and where Botodzi pleaded was victim impact statements. We haven't heard directly from the individuals themselves that were prejudiced as a result of the collapse of VBS. And it's so very important in our country in terms of restorative justice that we still hear from those people so that we can put a face to it. It's okay to speak about the fact that he drove a Ferrari and lived in a closed environment, but what about the people who funded that, the people whose monies have been taken, the people whose pensions are no longer as healthy as they should be as a result of this massive, massive fraud.
And Chad, earlier you spoke about following the money, and that's what you do with an investigation like this. But one would also ask, can we expect some sort of accountability? And the people that you speak of, the poorest of the poor who banked with the VBS, can they get justice for what has been done to them? Can we expect that to happen?
I sincerely hope so. That's why we have the Prudential Authority, which is a division of the South African Reserve Bank. We have legislation in place from the Mutual Banks Act, the Banks Act of 1990, and other legislation that's there to protect the consumer. When one looks at a case like this, we have to talk about financial restitution. Now, if we go back to the Criminal Procedures Act of 1977, it was a very forward-thinking act because it allows for financial restitution as a sanction in a fraud matter. So you can read into that. If one looks at the Prevention of Organised Crime Act of 1998, it talks about the proceeds of crime. It talks about interim restraints and preservation orders and how they can take money back and they can hold these funds. What we're seeing is that a lot of this fund goes into CARA. CARA is an account that's been set up. It's managed by the state. In particular, the funds are derived through interventions by the asset forfeiture unit. But what we need to see here is people made whole. The money can't just be placed into CARA that's recovered and then used to fight crime. That's very noble. But what's more noble is to ensure that people are made whole. And I think when we hear about the kind of people that have lost money in the VBS saga, this is now dragged on since 2017, 2018. The first conviction was 2020. We now have a conviction in 2024. We're talking about elderly folk, some of which have passed on, some of which died most probably in abject poverty. So we need to see something now. And the state is doing good work, but it's only going to be regarded as being good when we see people restored to the way they were before this happened.
All right, Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for your time and for that insight. That's Chad Thomas, Organised Crime Investigator from the IRS Forensic Investigations, just giving us a bit of insight there when it comes to the investigations which are being conducted within the VBS saga. And of course, that affidavit that has been leaked to the media.